I knew the dinner was falling apart the second I heard the coughing. Not normal coughing. The kind people use when they're trying not to spit food back onto the plate. 30 guests sat packed into Vanessa's dining room that night. Relatives. Church friends. A few wealthy business clients she'd been trying desperately to impress for months. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier. Soft piano music floated through the speakers. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Until people started tasting the food. Plates sat half untouched. A woman across the table quietly reached for her napkin after struggling to swallow a piece of roast chicken so dry it practically crumbled in her mouth. Someone near the kitchen whispered that the potatoes were still hard in the middle. The smell of burned gravy hung so heavily in the air I could almost taste the bitterness myself. And right in the center of it all was my daughter. Vanessa rushed frantically between the kitchen and dining room, forcing smiles that grew shakier every minute. I could see panic spreading across her face while guests exchanged uncomfortable looks and searched for polite excuses to leave early. Then she passed beside me and muttered under her breath through clenched teeth. "Mom, please don't say anything. You'll embarrass me even more." That sentence cut deeper than I can explain. Because humiliation from strangers fades. Humiliation from your own child settles somewhere permanent. I stood there silently while she continued spiraling, and all I could think about was the night 2 weeks earlier when she laughed at my cooking in front of the family. Honestly, she'd said with a little smirk on her face, "Mom's cooking is just old-fashioned trash nobody wants anymore." I still remember how quiet the room became after that. My grandson Tyler laughed nervously because he didn't know what else to do. My son-in-law stared down at his plate like he suddenly found mashed potatoes fascinating. And me. I just stood there smiling weakly while something inside me cracked open. Years of holidays. Years of stretching tiny grocery budgets after my husband died. Years of feeding that family with tired hands and a full heart. Reduced to trash. Now here we were. The same daughter who mocked me suddenly turned toward me with tears gathering in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered. "Please help me." For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I wanted revenge, but because this was the first time in her life she truly understood that feeding people isn't about appearances. It's about care, patience, sacrifice, love. And standing there in that kitchen, smelling burned gravy while 30 guests pretended not to notice the disaster unfolding around them, I felt torn between my pride and my heart. Stay with me till the end, because what happens next will shock you. And if you love emotional revenge stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more. Because the truth is, this disaster didn't begin in Vanessa's kitchen that night. It began months earlier, the first time my daughter started acting ashamed of me. And looking back now, I realize the warning signs were there all along. My name is Gloria Whitmore, and this is my story. Before all the bitterness and silence crept into our family, my life was simple. Quiet. Maybe. But full. I'd been widowed for almost 14 years by then, and after my husband passed, I learned how to make peace with small routines. My little house wasn't fancy, but it was warm. The walls carried decades of memories. Hand-stitched curtains hung in the kitchen window. Old family photographs covered the hallway. And every room smelled faintly of cinnamon, coffee, or fresh bread depending on the day. Cooking became my way of keeping people close. Every Sunday after church, my home filled with noise and laughter. I'd wake early to season roast beef, knead dough, peel potatoes, and bake pies while gospel music played softly from the radio. By noon, the table would be crowded with dishes and even more crowded with family. Back then, Vanessa used to stand beside me in the kitchen wearing one of my oversized aprons. She'd steal bits of peach filling when she thought I wasn't looking. We spent years cooking together like that. Holiday dinners. Birthday cakes. Thanksgiving stuffing recipes written on stained index cards. Those memories used to feel permanent. But slowly, after Vanessa got promoted at her marketing firm, something about her started changing. At first it was small things. She became obsessed with appearances. Expensive clothes. Fancy dinner parties. Social media videos showing off spotless countertops and trendy recipes with ingredients I couldn't even pronounce. Suddenly everything had to look polished. Even family dinners started feeling more like performances. "Mom, nobody cooks like this anymore," she laughed one afternoon while watching me fry chicken in my cast-iron skillet. I laughed too because I thought she was teasing. "I guess people still do around here," I told her. But looking back now, there was something sharp underneath her smile. Vanessa started calling my recipes heavy or outdated. She replaced homemade mashed potatoes with tiny roasted vegetables arranged like decorations. Fresh baked pies turned into store-bought desserts served on expensive plates. And then there were the moments that hurt quietly. One afternoon she was filming a cooking video in my kitchen when she suddenly stopped recording and frowned at my old mixing bowls. "Mom, can you move those out of the frame? They look kind of worn. Worn. Not loved. Not meaningful. Just embarrassing." I thought she was just finding her own way. I didn't realize she was slowly pushing me out of hers. Daniel mostly stayed quiet through all of it. He hated conflict so much he practically disappeared whenever tension started building. And Tyler, sweet as he used to be, began copying little pieces of Vanessa's attitude without even realizing it. Soon Vanessa started hosting dinners without asking for my help at all. Family recipes disappeared from the table, replaced by trendy meals she found online. And every now and then, I'd catch something in her tone when she talked about me around other people. Not irritation. Shame. Still, I ignored the feeling. I convinced myself mothers weren't supposed to take these things personally. Then came the family gathering where I baked my famous peach cobbler. That was the night my daughter looked at me differently for the very first time. The first time I truly felt embarrassed in front of my own family was during one of our Sunday dinners. I'd spent nearly the entire afternoon cooking. Roast chicken in the oven. Creamed corn simmering on the stove. Fresh biscuits wrapped in a towel to keep warm. The smell of garlic, butter, and rosemary filled the house the way it always had. For me, those smells meant comfort. Home. Family. At first, everything seemed normal. Tyler sat at the table scrolling through his phone while Daniel flipped through television channels in the living room. Vanessa arrived late carrying a sparkling bottle of expensive water and wearing heels far too fancy for a family dinner. The moment she walked into the kitchen, she glanced around like she was inspecting a restaurant she didn't approve of. "Wow," she said lightly, setting down her purse. "You really made all this?" I smiled. "Of course I did. Sit down before everything gets cold." But throughout dinner, little comments kept slipping out of her mouth like tiny cuts. "Mom still cooks like it's 1985, she laughed while spooning potatoes onto her plate. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Then she picked up one of the biscuits and added, "I keep telling her people eat lighter now." I felt my smile tighten. Daniel immediately focused very hard on cutting his chicken. Tyler snorted into his drink without looking up. I tried brushing it off. "Well, your grandfather loved meals like this." Vanessa shrugged. "Yeah, but presentation matters now, Mom. People care about aesthetics." Aesthetics. It was strange hearing my daughter talk about food like it was decoration instead of nourishment. As dinner continued, she kept correcting little things. She rearranged serving dishes after I placed them on the table. Quietly removed the gravy boat. Moved the butter aside like it was something shameful. At one point Tyler poked at the macaroni with his fork and said, "Grandma, this stuff's kinda greasy." The table fell silent for half a second. And even though he was only repeating what he heard at home, that comment hurt more than I wanted to admit. Children don't invent disrespect on their own. They learn it from somewhere. After dinner, while I packed leftovers into containers, I overheard Vanessa talking on the phone near the hallway. "Honestly," she said with a soft laugh, "my mom means well, but her cooking is really outdated." I froze. There was no anger in her voice. No cruelty. Somehow that made it worse. She sounded casual. Comfortable. Like being ashamed of me had become normal. That night after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes in silence. The sink water had gone cold, but I barely noticed. I kept replaying her words over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe this was just generational difference. Maybe I was too sensitive. But deep down, something uneasy had started growing inside me. And when Vanessa began obsessing over hosting a huge networking dinner for her coworkers and clients, I noticed something else too. She talked constantly about proving herself, about impressing people, about showing everyone she could do everything on her own. At the time, I didn't realize that dinner would eventually destroy the illusion she'd built around herself. After Vanessa's promotion, it felt like she started living inside a world where everything had to look expensive to matter. Her clothes changed first. Then her friends. Then the way she talked. The daughter who once danced barefoot in my kitchen while licking cake batter from a spoon suddenly started correcting the way I folded napkins at dinner parties. "Mom, the forks go on the other side," she'd whisper tightly whenever guests were around. Little things like that began happening constantly. At first, I told myself she was under pressure. Her company had given her more responsibility, more clients, more public events. She wanted to fit into a world filled with polished people who drank sparkling water out of crystal glasses and spoke in rehearsed voices. But slowly, I realized Vanessa wasn't just trying to impress people anymore. She was trying to escape where she came from. One evening she invited me to a small dinner gathering at her house with several coworkers. I spent the afternoon helping prepare food, chopping vegetables while she hovered nearby checking recipes on her phone every few minutes. The kitchen felt unfamiliar now. Cold marble counters. Expensive appliances. Decorative bowls nobody actually used. Not a single trace of warmth. While arranging appetizers, I reached for one of her serving trays and accidentally placed the cheese beside the wrong crackers. Vanessa sighed loudly. "Mom, not like that," she snapped under her breath. "These people notice details. These people." As if I didn't belong among them. Daniel tried easing the tension with nervous little jokes, but even he seemed uncomfortable around the version of Vanessa that appeared whenever guests arrived. He moved carefully around her moods like someone walking through broken glass barefoot. Later that night, while everyone drank wine in the dining room, I carried out a tray of stuffed mushrooms I'd made from scratch. One of Vanessa's co-workers smiled warmly after tasting one. "Oh wow," she said. "These are incredible." Before I could even thank her, Vanessa laughed lightly and waved her hand dismissively. "You should have tasted my mom's cooking 20 years ago," she joked. "Now everything's just super old-school comfort food." Everyone laughed politely. I forced myself to smile too. But something inside me sank. Then came the moment I'll never forget. I'd walked back toward the kitchen to refill drinks when I heard Vanessa talking near the hallway with two guests. "Honestly," she said with a laugh, "if my mom cooked for one of my work events, people would think we hired a retirement home chef." The women laughed awkwardly. I stopped moving. For a second, I honestly thought maybe I'd misheard her. But then Vanessa looked up and saw me standing there. And instead of looking ashamed, she rolled her eyes like I was the problem for hearing it. That was the moment something changed between us. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a door slowly closing. That night after everyone left, I stood alone in her kitchen washing dishes while tears rolled silently down my face. Nobody offered to help. Nobody noticed I'd gone quiet. I kept hearing her words over and over again. Retirement home chef. As if the meals that carried my family through sickness, grief, birthdays, and hard winters were suddenly something embarrassing. A little later, Vanessa walked into the kitchen scrolling through her phone. "Oh, and by the way," she said casually, "I'm hosting a huge networking dinner in a few weeks. About 30 people." I nodded slowly. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It is," she replied proudly. "But this could really help my career." I dried my hands on a towel and tried one last time. "If you want help planning the menu, I could. I don't need old-fashioned cooking lessons, Mom." She said it without even looking up from her screen. And somehow that hurt even more. Because in that moment, I stopped feeling like her mother. I started feeling like something she tolerated out of obligation. After that dinner party, something inside me began going quiet. Not angry quiet. Lonely quiet. I stopped calling Vanessa as often because every conversation somehow left me feeling smaller afterward. Still, I kept doing the things mothers do when they don't know how to stop loving their children. When Tyler caught the flu, I made homemade chicken soup and dropped it off at their house before sunrise. When Daniel mentioned he'd been working late shifts, I baked fresh bread and left it wrapped in towels so it would still be warm by dinner time. On Tyler's birthday, I spent 2 full days making his favorite chocolate cake from scratch. Vanessa barely looked up from her phone when I delivered it. "Thanks, Mom," she muttered distractedly before carrying it into the kitchen. No hug. No smile. Just thanks. And somehow indifference hurts more than cruelty sometimes. I started noticing unopened food containers sitting untouched in their refrigerator whenever I visited. Lasagna I'd made still covered in foil. Banana bread drying out on the counter. Meals that once would have brought my family running into the kitchen now sat ignored like unwanted leftovers. At night, I'd sit alone at my dining table staring at empty chairs while memories played through my mind like old films. I remembered stretching one pot of soup across 3 days after my husband died because money was tight. I remembered working double shifts at the nursing home, then coming home exhausted and still cooking homemade dinners because Vanessa deserved at least one stable thing in her life. I remembered teaching her how to roll pie crust with flour on her tiny hands while she giggled every time the dough stuck to the counter. Back then, she used to look at me like I could fix anything. Now she looked at me like I belonged to another century. I spent my life feeding that girl, and somehow she grew hungry for everything except kindness. Meanwhile, Vanessa became obsessed with preparing for her networking dinner. Every conversation revolved around it. Fancy menus. Imported ingredients. Videos about gourmet presentation. She spoke about the event like it was some grand performance that would finally prove she belonged among wealthy executives and polished social circles. But beneath all that confidence, I noticed cracks forming. One afternoon I stopped by unexpectedly and smelled smoke before Vanessa even opened the door. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. Burned pans stacked in the sink. Sauce splattered across the stove. Half-cooked meat abandoned on the counter. Vanessa looked exhausted. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. "Fine," she snapped too quickly. A few minutes later, I heard her yelling at Daniel in the living room because he'd bought the wrong kind of wine glasses. Tyler barely came downstairs anymore when she practiced cooking. The house felt tense all the time. Despite everything, I still wanted to help her. One evening before leaving, I quietly placed my handwritten roast chicken recipe on the kitchen counter beside her cookbooks. The same recipe Vanessa once begged me to teach her when she was younger. I thought maybe seeing my handwriting would soften something inside her. The next morning, I came back to return a casserole dish I'd forgotten. And there it was. My recipe card crumpled in the trash can beneath coffee grounds and paper towels. For a second, I couldn't breathe. "Mom," Vanessa sighed when she noticed me staring, "please stop interfering." Interfering. That word echoed inside me all the way home. That night, I sat awake wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I was outdated. Maybe my recipes, my traditions, even my way of loving people didn't fit into her world anymore. But underneath all the hurt, another feeling slowly started taking shape. Not anger. Disappointment. And then came the night Vanessa finally said the words I would never forget. 2 weeks before Vanessa's networking dinner, the whole family gathered at my house for Sunday supper. I remember spending extra time preparing that meal. Part of me hoped things might finally feel normal again. I seasoned the roast chicken the way my husband used to love it, with rosemary, garlic, and butter tucked carefully beneath the skin. I made mashed potatoes from scratch, fresh biscuits, green beans with bacon, and the peach cobbler Tyler used to beg for every summer. By the time everyone arrived, the house smelled warm and familiar. For a little while, it almost felt like old times. Tyler laughed at something on television. Daniel loosened his tie and complimented the biscuits before dinner even started. Vanessa actually smiled when she walked in. That tiny smile gave me hope I probably shouldn't have had. We all sat around the table together while I filled everyone's plates. At first, conversation stayed light. Then Vanessa took one bite of chicken and frowned dramatically. "Wow," she said, reaching for her water. "That's salty." The room went quiet for a second. "Oh," I said softly. I'm sorry if it's a little strong. She shrugged. I mean, it's okay. It's just heavy. Daniel immediately looked uncomfortable. I tried changing the subject, but Vanessa kept going. These meals are exactly why people don't cook like this anymore, she laughed. Everything's loaded with butter and carbs. Tyler smirked slightly while scrolling on his phone. I forced myself to smile. Well, nobody's forcing you to eat it. I'm serious, Mom, Vanessa continued. People care about healthier food now. Presentation too. You can't just throw gravy on everything and call it dinner. The words themselves hurt. But it was the tone that cut deepest. She wasn't talking to me like a daughter anymore. She sounded like someone publicly correcting an embarrassment. I noticed Daniel quietly staring at his plate again, pretending not to hear any of it. That silence made everything worse. Then Vanessa picked up one of the biscuits and laughed under her breath. Honestly, this cooking belongs in the past. I felt heat crawl into my chest. Still, I stayed calm. I've been cooking this way for 40 years, I said carefully. Nobody complained before. Vanessa leaned back in her chair with that same smug little smile I'd started seeing more and more lately. That's because people are polite. The room froze. Even Tyler finally looked up from his phone. And then she said the sentence that shattered whatever was left between us. Honestly, Mom, your cooking is trash compared to what people expect today. Silence crashed over the table so hard it almost rang in my ears. I looked at my daughter and suddenly couldn't recognize the person sitting there. Trash. That was the word she chose for the meals that carried her through childhood. The meals I cooked after 12-hour shifts. The meals that filled birthdays, funerals, Christmas mornings, and every hard season in between. Daniel opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Tyler gave an awkward little laugh before realizing nobody else was laughing. I could actually feel humiliation burning through me. Not because the food mattered that much, but because respect did. I could have handled criticism. I could have handled changing tastes. But humiliation from my own daughter. That shattered something inside me I don't think fully healed even now. Then Vanessa took another sip of wine and smiled proudly. You should come to my networking dinner next week, she said. Then you'll see what real entertaining looks like. For a moment, I almost argued. Instead, I slowly folded my napkin and looked directly at her. You're right, I said quietly. Maybe it's time I stopped cooking for everyone. Nobody understood what I meant. Not then. 3 days later, Vanessa called while I was folding laundry. Hey, Mom, she said quickly. I need help prepping some dishes for the dinner party. I stood there silently for a second. Then I answered calmly. You said my cooking was trash, Vanessa. I figured you wouldn't need my help anymore. There was a long pause. Wait, seriously, she asked, sounding shocked. Yes. Oh my God, Mom, you're being dramatic. No, I said softly. I'm finally listening. And for the first time in years, I told my daughter no. 3 days later, the networking dinner arrived. And so did karma. By the time I arrived at Vanessa's house for the networking dinner, the sun had already gone down and the driveway was packed with expensive cars. Everything looked beautiful from the outside. Soft golden lights glowed through the windows. Elegant music drifted from hidden speakers. Through the front door, I could see perfectly folded napkins, sparkling wine glasses, and candles flickering across a long dining table set for 30 guests. It looked like the kind of evening Vanessa had been dreaming about for months. But the second she opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Her smile looked forced, tight, fragile. And behind her, I smelled smoke. Mom, she said quickly, brushing hair away from her sweaty forehead. You made it. Before I could answer, someone in the kitchen yelled, Vanessa, the sauce is burning. She spun around in panic and disappeared down the hallway. I followed slowly behind her and stepped into complete chaos. Burned saucepans covered the stove. Half-cut vegetables were scattered across the counters. The roast chicken sat dry and splitting apart beneath heat lamps that had clearly been on too long. One tray of potatoes was still practically raw in the middle. Vanessa moved frantically between dishes with panic written all over her face. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I didn't see the cold, arrogant woman who mocked my cooking. I saw my daughter. Overwhelmed. Exhausted. Afraid. Guests started arriving faster than she could keep up with. Men in suits filled the dining room while women in elegant dresses complimented the decorations and accepted glasses of wine. Vanessa kept smiling for them. But I could hear her breathing getting shakier every minute. Dinner was served almost 40 minutes late. That's when everything truly collapsed. One man tried cutting into the chicken and quietly gave up halfway through. Another guest reached for water after tasting the gravy. Across the table, an elderly church friend discreetly spit food into her napkin while pretending to cough. The room filled with polite fake smiles and uncomfortable silence. Nobody wanted to embarrass Vanessa publicly. But everyone knew. And so did she. I watched her standing near the kitchen doorway pretending not to notice untouched plates while humiliation slowly spread across her face. Then she walked past me and muttered under her breath, "Mom, please don't say anything. You'll embarrass me even more." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Because even now, in the middle of disaster, part of her still cared more about appearances than feelings. A few guests started making excuses to leave early. One businessman quietly joked, "Maybe we should have eaten before coming." Several people laughed awkwardly. Vanessa looked like she might cry. And then came the moment that changed everything. Tyler pushed his plate away and said softly, without even thinking, "Grandma's food never tasted like this." The silence afterward felt enormous. Vanessa froze. For the first time all night, her confidence completely shattered. A few minutes later, she found me standing alone in the kitchen beside the stove. Her eyes were glassy with tears. "Mom," she whispered. "Please help me." I looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed her to understand what she'd done to me. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I finally asked quietly. It wasn't the insult. It was realizing my own daughter became ashamed of the woman who spent her whole life feeding her. Vanessa broke down crying almost immediately. Not dramatic crying. Real crying. The kind people do when pride finally collapses. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over again. "I just wanted people to respect me." I nodded slowly. "And you thought looking down on where you came from would help with that?" She couldn't answer. So I tied on an apron and quietly stepped beside her. Together, we started fixing what we could. I reheated the gravy properly. Made fresh biscuits from scratch. Added broth to the dry chicken. Seasoned the vegetables that had no flavor. Slowly, the tension in the dining room eased. Conversations returned. Guests relaxed again. But something between me and Vanessa had permanently changed that night. Because standing in that kitchen, watching my daughter finally understand the difference between impressing people and caring for them, I realized something too. This was the moment I knew our relationship would never survive unless something truly changed. The strange thing about karma is that it rarely arrives the way people expect. There was no screaming match after the dinner disaster. No dramatic family explosion. No moment where I stood in front of everyone demanding apologies while Vanessa cried in humiliation. Honestly, I think that would have been easier for her. Instead, the consequences settled slowly into her life like cold weather creeping through an open window. In the days after the networking dinner, people talked. Not cruelly. Not viciously. Just honestly. Several guests mentioned how stressed Vanessa had seemed. Others quietly praised how I stepped into the kitchen and somehow saved the evening from complete disaster. One woman from Vanessa's office even stopped me outside church the following Sunday. "Your daughter's lucky to have you," she said warmly. "Most people would have walked away after being treated like that." I thanked her politely, but the words stayed with me. Because for the first time in a long while, somebody saw me clearly. Meanwhile, Vanessa struggled with the embarrassment of the dinner. Not because people mocked her food, but because her perfect image had cracked open in front of everyone she desperately wanted approval from. And underneath that embarrassment was something worse. Guilt. I could see it every time she looked at me afterward. But I didn't punish her. I simply stopped sacrificing myself for someone who no longer valued it. For years, I'd spent my life rushing to rescue everyone else. Cooking whenever they asked. Rearranging my days around their needs. Pretending disrespect didn't hurt me just to keep peace in the family. That version of me quietly disappeared after that dinner. The next time Vanessa called asking if I could prepare food for one of Tyler's school events, I calmly told her no because I already had plans. And for once, my plans mattered too. A month later, one of the ladies from church convinced me to teach a small cooking class at the community center. I almost refused at first. I figured nobody wanted old-fashioned recipes anymore. I was wrong. The room filled up faster than expected. Young couples came wanting to learn homemade meals from scratch. Single fathers asked questions about soup recipes their children might actually eat. Teenagers laughed while learning pie crust techniques from recipe cards older than they were. And every single week, people thanked me. Not just for the food. For the warmth. For the patience. For making cooking feel personal instead of performative. For the first time in years, I felt appreciated instead of tolerated. Then one afternoon, Tyler showed up unexpectedly at my front door holding one of my handwritten recipe cards. "Grandma," he asked shyly, "can you teach me how to make your peach cobbler?" I smiled before I could stop myself. Of course I can. While we measured flour together in the kitchen, I noticed Vanessa standing quietly near the doorway watching us. She didn't interrupt. She didn't criticize anything. She just stood there listening to Tyler laugh while I explained how to tell when peaches were perfectly ripe. And when she thought I wasn't looking, I saw her wipe tears from her eyes. That was the real revenge. Not humiliation. Not cruelty. Simply watching my daughter realize that the very things she mocked were the same things holding our family together all along. Sometimes karma isn't destruction. Sometimes it's forcing someone to see what they almost lost. But even then, the hardest conversation between us still hadn't happened. About 6 weeks after the networking dinner, Vanessa came to see me alone. I still remember opening the front door and barely recognizing her. There was no expensive blazer. No carefully styled hair. No polished smile prepared for strangers. She stood there wearing simple jeans and an oversized sweater, holding her car keys so tightly her knuckles looked pale. For the first time in a very long while, she looked less like a woman performing confidence and more like my daughter again. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside without saying much. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. A peach cobbler cooled on the counter while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Vanessa looked around the room slowly, almost like she was seeing the place differently for the first time. Or maybe seeing herself differently inside it. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table in silence for a while before she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I stayed quiet and let her continue. Vanessa looked down at her hands. Not just for the dinner. For all of it. Then the words started pouring out. For mocking my cooking in front of people. For treating family traditions like they were embarrassing. For teaching Tyler disrespect without realizing it. For becoming so obsessed with fitting into a different world that she started looking down on the people who loved her most. Tears slid down her face before she even noticed them. "I think," she whispered shakily, "I think I became ashamed of where I came from." That sentence hurt to hear. But somehow it also explained everything. I reached for my coffee slowly before answering. "There's nothing shameful about where you came from, Vanessa," I said softly. "The shame comes from forgetting who stood beside you before success did." She started crying harder after that. Not because I yelled. Because I didn't. I think kindness can feel heavier than anger when someone already knows they were wrong. Eventually Daniel and Tyler started coming around more often too. Family dinners slowly returned, but they felt different now. Smaller. Quieter. More honest. Vanessa never mocked my cooking again. In fact, one afternoon she showed up carrying a stack of notebooks and asked if we could start organizing all my handwritten recipes into a proper family cookbook so Tyler could have them someday too. I nearly cried right there at the kitchen counter. Some wounds don't disappear completely. Even forgiveness leaves scars behind sometimes. But little by little, we started rebuilding something real again. And one evening, while Tyler rolled pie dough beside me and Vanessa laughed after accidentally spilling flour across the counter, I looked around the kitchen and realized something. The same hands my daughter once mocked had become the hands she finally reached for again.